This lesson looks at the definition of political risk and why it's important for any economic analyst or any economist or any business person to understand it in the context of their businesses or studying an economy. So first of all, what is political risk? Although there's no single definition, in broad terms, political risks are risks that a business or investor or government may face when there's a change in politics or political outcomes. As such, if there's a change in the politics of a country that negatively affects your goals as a business or investor, then that is a political risk. Political risk is really hard to measure and anticipate because, first of all, it's not a quantitative thing, it's more of an event, and it's often the result of people's decisions, so it could be an irrational decision, which is hard to anticipate. One thing key to remember, I would say, is that political risk is often influenced by many elements of economic or financial markets risk, so you better not ignore either of them. You should look at them in conjunction. So why do we care about political risk? Well, political risk is important because it helps to understand what risks a company could face in a particular country. So for example, a mining company wants to invest in Mongolia to produce copper for the next 20 years. What are the risks associated with that investment from a political perspective? Will the government nationalize them? Will they change the terms? Will they face lots of legislative problems or legal challenges? Similarly, a food company may be operating in Venezuela. The food company may decide to raise its prices because it has to raise prices because its costs are going up. But what happens if the government in Venezuela doesn't like the fact that they're raising prices because they want to keep inflation low and they nationalize that food company? Well, that's something which actually happened. Third, imagine you have high levels of unemployment and rising food prices in the Middle East, which is something that happened. Now, people who are unemployed combined with rising food prices, their incomes are being squeezed, they don't have opportunity to create wealth, they don't have jobs, they're not happy, and that could lead to a lot of revolt or the overthrowing of the government, which happened in many countries in the Middle East. So the point is to highlight how political risk can affect each and every one of us, either directly or indirectly, no matter what country you're in or sector you're operating in. Political risk can impact everyone. Now, there are different types of political risk, and you can define them in different ways. Some analysts like to define them into two broad categories. So a macro risk, which is country related and relates and will affect all sectors in exactly the same way because it's a very broad political risk, let's say a change of government or a fall of government. But then there are also micro risks, which are more sector related, and these can be risks associated with a change of policy with a particular change, let's say to the utility sector or electricity prices or transport, in which that causes a micro risk or a risk related to that sector, but not other sectors. So below I'm going to list some examples of types of political risk which we would have seen over the past few years. So high levels of crime and violence. So if there's a lot of crime, then that's bad for investment. People feel unsafe. Terrorism is another political risk. The nationalization of property. So let's say I own a factory and someone comes over and says, sorry, this factory is now mine. That's one form of political risk because it's the government taking away your property. Disorderly political manifestations, civil unrest and riots. This could result in looting and stoppages, in protests which stops the flow of traffic and transportation. That's one form of political risk that will affect your business. Armed conflict within your country or a neighboring country. A foreign threat of invasion, for example, that's a political or military threat from another country. Weak political institutions are a form of political risk because if the judiciary is not independent, let's say, or the courts don't work well, then that could lead to corruption, and that itself is high levels of corruption is a form of political risk because it's hard to do anything properly, there's no accountability, the justice system doesn't work. And then a big area of political risk is large and unpredictable changes in government policy. So that's more related to, I guess, micro and macro risks. But if a government changes policy quite dramatically, then there's no lack of consistency, and businesses, investors, and people do not know what to expect from the government, and they possibly won't invest. So how does one measure political risk? Well, actually, that's very hard, right? A bunch of questions around how to measure political risk. For example, what type of indicators are you going to look at, right? How do you measure or quantify them? So you're trying to quantify a qualitative assessment. What number, what scale do you use, right? So also, what does each indicator try and measure? Are you trying to measure corruption? Are you trying to measure volatility of policy? Are you trying to measure the strength of the judiciary? So measuring political risk can actually be very tricky, and each model of risk will be different depending on what you're trying to capture. And in the next slide, you'll see some different examples. So there are various public and private sector enterprises which try and capture political risk, and sometimes they'll each focus on different areas. So for example, Transparency International tries to measure the levels of corruption in different countries and sectors. Doing Business is part of the IFC and World Bank and tries to measure and rank how difficult it is to conduct business in a particular economy. So it's more related to business environment risk, but it's also has some political elements to that. The Economist Intelligence Unit, which is part of The Economist, they have their own risk ratings, and it looks at both political and economic risk, like their indices. The important thing here to remember is that although methodologies are different and they're trying to measure different things in some cases, these models or these ratings, these risk ratings or indices, are designed to offer cross-country comparisons to better understand levels of political risk in one country relative to another. So you can automatically compare Nigeria to Brazil, US to UK, or Sweden, Japan, etc. So what it does, it creates a measurement and an index by which you can compare like for like. So I guess the last question in terms of political risk, or the introduction to political risk, is how to interpret political risk. And it's somewhat of a vague question and will result in a bit of a vague answer. So there's no single answer to this, but one way of looking at political risk can fall into two categories, and this is how I would look at it. So the first one is policy making, and the second one is protection of property rights. I think these two are probably one of the most important. These two are in terms of understanding political risk. Policy making is important because as a business or investor, there's a lot of uncertainty around the future. And if you have very low credibility in the ability to formulate policy, and you have very little credibility in the ability to execute policy, then that means that political risk will run very high. And if that is continually the case, in which you're not able to make policy changes and policy improvements, the country will not continue to improve in terms of its political institutions and its economic development. And this could result in a lot of political risk, protests, bad economic policies, bad political policies. And so policy making is very important. The second one is protection of property rights. The reason why this is important is because in order for a country to grow over the long term, you need to be able to invest in productive assets, whether it's transportation linkages, schools, factories, etc. If you do not have the protection of property rights, and property rights can be taken away from you at will, then no one will invest. And that lack of investment will lead to very slow economic growth or no economic development at all. And this in turn will cause dissent within the population, could cause protests, very slow growth, etc., etc. And the worst case scenario is that you have no policy making whatsoever and a very poor economy. And that could result in an uprising, the overthrowing of a government, the installation of a dictatorship, and so forth. So as such, for me, political risk, the way I like to think about it, is broadly in terms of, is there good policy making and is there good protection of property rights? However, other analysts and other people may look at other things in more detail. In broad terms, I'll look at these two.